Eliot Higgins, thanks for joining us. The BBC and ITN rejected you for their trainee schemes, and yet here we are. You were responsible for identifying the suspects in the Skripal poisoning, the use of cluster bombs in Syria, and now potentially those responsible for bringing down flight MH17 and the murder of its 298 occupants. What a ride.
Yeah, I mean, when I started doing this, it was just a hobby I was doing in my spare time, and just over the years it built up an audience, and we suddenly found ourselves working on really, really big stories.
The impact you've had from someone who presumably was working at home for the majority of it, and yet you're literally setting the news agenda.
Yeah, I mean, when I started doing this, I had a full-time job. I was working in admin and finance roles for various companies, and I just saw videos coming from conflict zones that were being ignored because people couldn't trust them. And I was also seeing bits of information that would appear online I was looking at Libya at that time, just as an interesting thing that was happening in the world at the time. And I kept on seeing sort of journalists saying stuff that didn't make it into their news stories, but when you collected all those little bits of information together, there was an interesting story there. And that's where I realised you could start using all these sources online to actually start constructing stories and have an understanding of what was happening on the ground in places like Libya, even though you couldn't actually be there in person.
So you were well versed in the internet before you started getting into journalism?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think you would describe me nowadays as being extremely online. I used to spend a lot of time on the internet, a lot of time on the Guardian Middle East live blogs comment section arguing with other people. But in a way, it's those arguments that kind of helped me become a good investigator, because you encounter people online who are arguing a point not from a particularly honest standpoint, but if you argue with that and debate it and try and make your point, you actually hone your skills. You actually, start saying, okay, even though they might not be entirely honest in the discussion they want to have, at least I can actually try and answer these questions and use that as a learning experience.
Gaming as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I used to play an awful lot of World of Warcraft before I got married. I realised I had to knock that on the head before I got married. Otherwise, that would be a very short marriage, based off the experiences of some of my other guild members on World of Warcraft. So that kind of, I knocked that on the head, and I've always had a bit of an obsessive personality. I got married, and then we had our first child. It was actually in late 2011, and all my hobbies went out the window. I was like, okay, I need to find something to do. So I thought I'll just do a quick hobby I can pick up and put down. I thought, why don't I start blogging about some of these videos I'm seeing from Syria now? And then it just turned into this kind of huge new project and this new field of investigation that now we're working with groups like the International Criminal Court and lawyers on arms exports to Yemen and investigating the MH17 case and helping the police with various investigations. So it's gone from, just something that was a hobby I thought no one would care about into this whole kind of, this whole Bellingcat now.
Do you think there are transferable skills from your time gaming to now doing research? Is there much crossover? Did one set you up for the other?
I'm not sure if it's so much transferable skills, but I think certain kinds of gaming appeals to a certain kind of mindset that's actually also very useful for open source investigations, where you have to have a certain degree of obsessiveness, but also be quite creative with the way you approach problems. And I find a lot of people now who are really good at open source investigation are also the kind of people who play a lot of strategy games on their computers and that kind of stuff like that, because they're used to looking at a problem and breaking it down and then looking at different approaches using different tools. Someone once told me that with the kind of work we do with open source investigation it's like I found the best computer game in the world to play, because I'm on my laptop doing all these puzzles and investigations, but it actually has an impact on the real world.
We can get into the detail of MH17 and what happened there, but I was wondering if first you'd be able to tell us an anecdote about you secured something that's fairly unprecedented in making the Russian MOD, I think it was, retract an official press release that they put out.
Yes, so the Russian MOD put out a series of images on their social media pages. So they have a Facebook page and a Twitter account, and they did it in Russian, English and Arabic. Lots of effort into this press release, where they claimed they had drone images that showed irrefutable evidence, as they described it, of the US helping ISIS by covering their retreats from Iraqi towns they were fighting in. So they had these 4 screenshots. And I was looking at these screenshots and I noticed something rather unusual about one of them. I'd seen the screenshot 2 weeks earlier, and it was from a tweet that was actually done by an Indian journalist, and she was sharing a video this time saying this shows US forces attacking an ISIS convoy. And you could see from the preview image, it was very similar to the one that the Russians had used. The thing that was really odd about that is that video shared by the Indian journalist was from a computer game. AC-130 gunship simulator. And I realized that the Russian MOD had actually used a screenshot from a computer game as irrefutable evidence that the US was helping ISIS combat operations. But because, in a way, there'd been this inoculation previously because of this Indian journalist's tweet and people responding saying it's a computer game, I'm the sort of person who's followed by people on Twitter who follow the Russian MOD. So they saw the Russian MOD sharing this video I had shared 2 weeks earlier saying it was from a computer game, and they immediately reacted to it. It was like immediately, because they'd been inoculated against that piece of propaganda in a way. And what that meant is, rather than the kind of media narrative around these images being ISIS is being helped by the US, it was Russia is using computer game images as irrefutable evidence of stuff. And they were widely mocked. Even the likes of Russia Today, who are usually very supportive, even had, mocking tweets that people had made about it in their story about it. So it completely ruined their reputation. And even now people say if Russia presents a satellite image, oh, is it from a computer game? But it's an example as well of, with Russia, how they do stuff that is like really stupid when it comes to this kind of stuff. It's like really, who takes a computer game image and thinks they can get away with sharing it on social media? I mean, if it's on the internet, it's the one place people are going to figure out it's from a computer game, if anywhere.
What do you think the underlying emotion is there? Is it arrogance, do you think?
I think it's a mixture of hubris, arrogance, incompetence. Just assuming the world is a way that it isn't anymore. And this is something that caused them a lot of problems with the MH17 case as well.
So let's talk about that. It's 5 years to the day since MH17 was shot down. There are actually several air disasters around that time. Could you refresh us what happened to MH17?
Yeah, so with MH17, there was a aircraft that had flown from Amsterdam with 298 people on board. As it went over eastern Ukraine, it disappeared from radar. And moments later, there were reports of an aircraft being shot down. Initially, it was understood that it was a government aircraft, but very quickly people realized it was MH17, this commercial aircraft. And very quickly, two narratives were created. One from the Russian side is that Ukraine shot it down either by accident or as part of a false flag against Russia, or from the Western Ukrainian side that a missile launcher had shot it down from the side of the separatists. And that was really where our investigation started with Bellingcat.
What was the scene like on the ground?
Well, you're talking about a commercial airliner with everything you expect to see inside it. People's, guidebooks to where they were flying to, children's toys, just luggage, clothing, everything you would expect to see in an airport, just scattered across a 50-kilometre area. We spoke to a lot of journalists for the podcast who were actually there on the day and the days afterwards talking about the scene. And it was a scene of terrible carnage, but the way it was just everywhere around them when they arrived there, that they were talking about seeing, bodies on the side of the road they'd walked past at night because it was too dark to see, and they woke up the next day 20 feet away and realised they'd been camping next to just this absolute massive scene of carnage. There's a lot of talk after the first 48 hours about the smell as well, because this was a huge area of 298 people. It wasn't just bodies, but fragments of people. There was a massive amount of destruction, and because it was a hot summer's day, there was this smell. And then they started recovering the bodies and taking it to a train where they were going to move the bodies out of the town, but no one knew what was going on, so they didn't know if the refrigeration carriage was working properly, for example, and they were putting bodies into it. And it was just, they described it, the people who were there, as a scene from hell. It was just unbelievable what had happened there.
You touched on it earlier. How significant was the Russian disinformation campaign at the time?
Well, within a few days of MH17 being shot down, Russia gave a press conference on July 21st. It was the Russian Ministry of Defense. They had what they claimed was their evidence that they had gathered about what may have happened. Now, they did something quite clever. Rather than making a statement like Ukraine shot down MH17, they would they would present some satellite imagery, and they say there was a Buk missile launcher in this Ukrainian base on July 14th, and now it's gone on July 17th. What's going on? Why was this missile launcher moving? What we discovered is the evidence they were presenting was fake, that the satellite imagery showing a moving missile launcher had actually been edited. We could compare satellite imagery from other sources, like you find on Google Earth, for the days they were talking about, and we could prove, for example, that trees that were visible in the photograph they shared on the satellite image had been cut down before July. And all these little lies started to come out, and that's when I think it was probably a surprise for Russia when we started picking apart all these claims, because they're used to giving press conferences, saying stuff, and then it being accepted by the media and the press, and it says, oh, Russia said this and Ukraine says this, what is the truth? But we were able to say, look, using open source material, we can show that these are lies, that this is just simply untrue. A few days after 298 people have been killed and we have these horrific scenes, rather than facing up to what they've done, they're lying. They're presenting fake evidence to the world. And this very much set up the way in which Russia treated MH17. They pretended they were cooperating all the time and saying, why won't anyone listen to us? We're presenting all this evidence and it's being ignored. Well, it was being ignored because it was established as being fake. And this is really where we got involved with Bellingcat, where we first started identifying the route of the missile launcher in Ukraine because people had taken photographs of it and shared it on social media. We then were able to track it back to Russia, where we found the same missile launcher in a convoy from a few weeks before MH17 was shot down that went from the city of Kursk in Russia to the border with Ukraine, with this missile launcher that shot down MH17. And then we could start identifying all the soldiers in that brigade because they were all on social media, tagging each other, posting photographs of themselves in their uniforms. So then we had the full military structure for that. So just from all this public information, we could reconstruct so much information about what actually happened.
And why do you think they would obfuscate the facts in that manner?
Because they were guilty. It was their missile launcher. This is what we discovered in the investigation. They had sent a missile launcher across the border. It was sent over on the morning of July 17th over night. And then we have a series of phone calls that were published by the Ukrainian intelligence agency, the SBU, and the Joint Investigation Team. And in these calls, they're often, when they're published, only have maybe a phone number or a pseudonym or some bits of information, but it's people talking about MH17 being shot down, separatist commanders and other individuals. And most recently, one thing we've done is we've identified all these people. We've used clues in the audio to figure out who they were and where they were. So on July 17th, we have one call where someone phones up someone else and says, there's a birdie flying towards you. And he's talking about spotting this aircraft. And he says, I haven't seen it myself because of the cloud cover, but there's an aircraft coming towards you. And we discovered that this person, when we identified him, he made the call when his military unit was based underneath the flight path of MH17 as it was heading towards the person he was calling, who was with the missile launcher. And it just happens a few minutes later, the missile launcher fires at this target and destroys it, and it's MH17. So this whole story is there through the open source material, but also by one thing we do with the podcast is we reconstruct the events from the eyes of the separatists using those intercepted phone calls. The whole narrative is there from their perspective. So you know why they wanted it, because they were being attacked from the air by Ukrainian Air Force, and it was a big problem for them. There had already been military equipment sent by Russia over the border. And this is also something very important that people forget about MH17 or don't realise. The fact a Russian missile launcher was sent over the border was not unusual, because that was happening all the time. This was an ongoing involvement of the Russian military. But this is why it makes it so hard for the Russians to admit the truth, because they've said time and time again, we are not involved with what's happening with eastern Ukraine. Whilst in fact they're sending over military equipment, they're doing cross-border artillery attacks, which is something else we wrote about, and this eventually led to MH17 being shot down.
Those phone calls are included in the podcast, aren't they? In the first series of Bellingcat podcast that's coming out. You have access to those phone calls and they're played in that.
Yeah, that's right. So we referred to them a bit in earlier episodes, but in episode 5, that's when we take everything and reconstruct the entire day and the build-up and the aftermath from their perspective using these intercepted phone calls.
The podcast covers what happened, it has those phone calls, and then it looks forward. People are suing Vladimir Putin over this, aren't they?
Yeah, so there's the European Court of Human Rights case where I believe they're currently asking for about 3 billion euros from Russia. I think they have about 300 family members, each asking for 10 million euros each. So it's a huge sum of money, but there they need to prove that Russia was responsible for shooting down MH17. Now that's slightly different from some courts where you don't actually have to prove who pressed the button, just that there's enough evidence there to make the case that Russia is responsible for what happened. One challenge they have to overcome is normally you would have to go to the local court and actually try and do it through a Russian court, but they're making the case that that's just not going to be possible. No lawyer in Russia is going to take that case against the Russian government. So that's kind of one of the first challenges they have, to convince the European Court of Human Rights that's the case. But if it's successful, then Russia could find itself facing a huge fine. There's also other court cases in the works. We now have the main court case, which is the Joint Investigation Team investigation, where they've charged 4 suspects. And now that's going to take place in March 2020. So what we're going to see then is lots more information being released about what happened, what witnesses they have. As the Joint Investigation Team has released information, but it's been heavily based off the kind of open source information we've been sharing, rather than new information. But it's clear from the small amount of new information they do release that they've got witnesses, they've got more satellite imagery and other data that makes their case. Plus, they've got massive amounts of intercepted calls. I believe it was something like 150,000 calls were shared with them as part of the investigation.
It's understandable that some Russian lawyers may not want to take this case because of what happened to another lawyer who was taking on one of the family's cases. Is that right?
Yeah, but there's one lawyer I've been helping with the European Court of Human Rights case, Jerry Skinner, who's based in the US. And just before Christmas, a year or two ago, he discovered his office had been broken into, and all his presents he'd been buying for his wife were left alone, but all his kind of hard drive and files have been ransacked by someone either looking for something or trying to make a threat to him because of the work he was doing on the case.
What was left on his desk?
He says that there was a picture of Vladimir Putin left on his desk.
It's a message.
Yeah, it seems like it, yes.
Are you concerned, hearing stories like that a couple of Russian tourists might turn up in Leicester to go and look at the spire of the cathedral?
It is a very nice cathedral. You can get a bit paranoid. It's like when we were first releasing our Skripal inquiry stuff, that was exposing intelligence officers of the Russian intelligence services, which is a scary thing to do, especially when the officers involved literally had poisoned someone, earlier that year. So when I was putting that out, that was very nerve-wracking. And you do start getting paranoid. It's like I was staying at a hotel recently, and it's one I stay in quite a bit, and there was a knock on my door at night. I was surprised by, because I hadn't expected anything to come to the room. And I opened it up, and it was a guy in a suit wearing a name badge saying, "Oh, hi, I'm the duty manager of the hotel. You've stayed here 10 times. We'd like to give you a gift." And I hadn't heard of anyone receiving a gift for staying at a hotel 10 times. And had I stayed there 10 times, I didn't know. So I said thank you, and I was a bit suspicious. I liked the cookies, but I was also thinking, I have no idea who this person is. It could be literally anyone with a name badge. So I looked at the cookies, and they were very delicious looking, but I thought I can't possibly eat any of those. So I kind of just left it in the bin of my hotel room and felt sad, checked out, gave my key in, and just as I was leaving, someone came up to me and said, "Oh, hi, I'm the duty manager. I hope you enjoyed the cookies we gave you last night." I was thinking, oh no, I've left all my cookies in the room. And
they're going to find them.
Yeah, like I hated them. I hate your cookies. I throw them in the bin.
He's been here 10 times, but he hates it. The truth must be incredibly important to you, because if you're looking over your shoulder in an instance like that, what's your motivation?
It's something that's evolved over time. I mean, I did start this because of my own interest in what's happening in Syria and realising that you could extract this information from it. But as I've done my work, I've seen the value it has for justice and accountability. We do a lot of work now looking at how we use this kind of investigation in courts like the International Criminal Court. We're doing something at the moment where we're working on examining Saudi airstrikes in Yemen and presenting the evidence we gather as part of an appeal against arms export agreements to Saudi Arabia, which is probably not going to earn us any more friends doing that. But that is the kind of thing that I realise now, with my work, that you can take all these things that we've been doing over the last several years, what we learnt with MH17, and actually apply it in a way that takes, the people on the ground, they're filming stuff, sharing it online because they want the world to know about this terrible thing that's happened. It could be Syria or Eastern Ukraine or wherever. And they need kind of like an interface between what they've done on the ground, the recording of this atrocity that they want the world to know about and they want there to be accountability for, and the people who actually make the accountability happening, these big courts, the UN and other bodies. And we're kind of the process between finding that online and actually getting it to those organisations so that they can use it. Because now you don't have that kind of capability at organisations. You would think, well, this seems valuable, lots of people must be doing it, but it's really not the case at all. So for the moment, we're kind of the stopgap between those organisations catching up and doing it themselves. But I think there's always going to be a role for kind of NGOs like Bellingcat to do this kind of investigation work, almost be the first kind of response to seeing this content appearing online, rather than it being, UN panels that take a year and a half to get set up, or an ICC investigation that takes months to get set up because of just the rules they face, whilst we can react very, very quickly to it.
Would you say that information warfare is becoming more dangerous than conventional warfare?
Potentially, and I think what's often very overlooked with this is we often are talking about you can, have social media campaigns on Twitter and, fake news, and everyone thinks about the 2016 election with Trump and Russian interference. But there's also another danger, closed social networks, because with open social networks, there's a certain element of distrust in the information you're receiving. With closed social networks like WhatsApp groups, you don't have that, because you choose to join a group and then people are sharing information, so you're more likely to trust it. Now, what's happened in some countries is this has actually led to ethnic violence happening, because rumours start getting spread in these groups. There's no one who can come in from the outside and start countering them, and it triggers violence. And that violence we've seen in Myanmar, for example, that was part of the reason for this violence being triggered. It's happened in India and elsewhere in the world. So for me, that is almost more of a threat than the kind of influence on open social networks, although there is still a threat there. And, questions about Cambridge Analytica, for example, that's a very big issue as well. And how you react to fake news. It's like the earlier example with the Russian MOD sharing a computer game image. That was resisted because people were engaged with a topic who could react to that. But when it's something that's new or unusual, then often you don't have that kind of defense against this new kind of information. It's like when we had the Iran tanker attacks, or the supposed attacks, and you had this information coming from the US. At first it seemed convincing. You had video evidence, you had photographs, but really what that showed wasn't what they were claiming as clearly as they claimed. It fit with what they were saying, but you never saw a clear shot of the actual limpet mine they said was there. And when they started showing the video they recorded, they started at a point where they were basically obscuring the limpet mine anyway, so you couldn't see it in the video. So that's not to say that this was an attempt at a cover-up, but it's just the way they present evidence is not really consistent with what people expect online now. You expect a lot better information before you have the case made to you. And this is especially true with the US because of what happened with the Iraq War.
Have you been looking at Cambridge Analytica?
Not too much. I mean, it's one of those things. We have very limited time and very limited resources, and there's a lot of already really good investigators working on Cambridge Analytica, so it kind of feel like we wouldn't be contributing so much, but on the other areas we're looking at, there's not so many people working on it, so it feels like we can kind of add more to the understanding of that topic.
Eliot Higgins, thanks for taking the time.
Thank you very much.
How does someone become a naked body? The fall must have just completely stripped off their clothing. There were bodies that were still strapped into the seats of the plane, and their seatbelts were fastened with their heads down and arms forward, and others were completely ripped apart.
The world is watching reports of a downed passenger jet near the Russia-Ukraine border, and it looks like it may be a terrible tragedy.
There's an old saying, a lie can travel halfway around the world before the truth starts to tie its shoes.
There was people at work on the crime scene trying to cover up the truth.
Almost 300 people died, and we are 5 years further, and we don't know the whole story yet.